Some of the deepest longings of the human heart are for connection and family, especially when we face our hardest moments alone. There's something powerful about finding love where you least expect it, when hope seems lost and winter threatens everything you hold dear. In 1800s Montana, schoolteacher Eliza Hartford thinks her biggest worry is surviving the harsh winter at her isolated frontier schoolhouse. Then, mountain man Silas Grizzly McGraw appears with a shocking declaration that changes everything. This weathered giant who has survived decades in the wilderness makes her an offer that terrifies and intrigues her. What follows is a story of two lonely souls finding each other in the most unlikely circumstances. But can a proper schoolteacher really build a life with a man who lives by nature's brutal rules? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of impending snow as Eliza Hartford stepped outside the one-room schoolhouse, her worn leather teaching satchel clutched against her chest like armor against the gathering dusk. The satchel held everything that remained of her former life: pressed flowers from her mother's garden in Philadelphia, a daguerreotype of her family's brownstone, and the tattered letter of recommendation that had secured her this position. In the Montana Territory's most isolated settlement, she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to reach this remote valley, nestled between towering peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. The journey had taken 3 months, first by train to the end of the rails, then by wagon train across endless prairie, and finally by pack mule up treacherous mountain paths that would have terrified her Philadelphia sensibilities just a year ago. Now those sensibilities felt like clothes that no longer fit, discarded somewhere between the Missouri River and the Continental Divide. The schoolhouse itself was a testament to frontier determination. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke efficiently despite its humble appearance, and windows made of real glass that had cost the settlement dearly. Inside, 8 wooden desks sat in neat rows, each one handcrafted by the fathers of the children who would occupy them. The walls bore her carefully drawn alphabet charts and a map of these United States, though she sometimes wondered if those distant eastern cities still existed, or if the world had shrunk to encompass only these mountains and the handful of souls who called them home. Her students came from homesteads scattered across the valley, the Hendersons with their twin boys who could track a deer through fresh snow, the widow McAllister whose daughter Sarah possessed a mind sharp enough for any university back east, and the Kowalski family, whose youngest still mixed Polish phrases with his English in ways that made Eliza's heart ache for her own grandmother's immigrant stories. These children represented the future of this harsh land, and she felt the weight of that responsibility every morning when she lit the wood stove and prepared their lessons. The isolation had not been part of her plan. When she'd accepted the teaching position, responding to an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, she had imagined a small but proper town with other educated women, perhaps a lending library, maybe even a church social or two. Instead, she found herself the only unmarried woman for 50 miles, living in a tiny cabin behind the schoolhouse with only her books and her determination for company. Her days began before dawn, splitting kindling and stoking the fire that would keep the schoolhouse warm enough for learning. She melted snow for water, prepared simple meals from her dwindling supplies, and spent her evenings by lamplight, preparing lessons and mending clothes that showed the wear of frontier life. Her hands, once soft from a life of genteel pursuits, now bore calluses and small scars from the daily necessities of survival. The loneliness was a living thing, pressing against her chest in the long evening hours. She wrote letters to her sister, Margaret in Philadelphia, though the mail run came only once a month, if weather permitted. Margaret's responses, when they arrived, spoke of concerts and dinner parties, of beaux who called on Sunday afternoons, and the latest fashions from Paris. Reading them felt like peering through a window into a life that had once been hers, but now seemed as foreign as tales from a storybook, but there were moments of unexpected joy. When young Tommy Henderson finally mastered his multiplication tables and his face lit up with pride. When Sarah McAllister read aloud from Shakespeare, with such passion that the rough schoolhouse walls seemed to transform into a London theatre. When the entire valley came together for the harvest celebration, and for one evening, the isolation melted away in the warmth of shared laughter and fiddle music. The approaching winter weighed on everyone's minds. The old-timers spoke of previous winters that had buried cabins to their rooflines, of families who had run out of food before the spring thaw, of the terrible silence that could drive a person to madness. Eliza had laid in supplies as best she could: flour, salt pork, dried beans, and enough firewood to last until March. Though she prayed it would be enough, her greatest fear was not starvation or cold, but the crushing weight of months alone, with only her thoughts for company. She had fled Philadelphia to escape the suffocating expectations of society marriage to a man she could never love, but sometimes, in the deep mountain silence, she wondered if she had traded one prison for another. The evening light was fading fast, painting the peaks in shades of purple and gold that still took her breath away after 6 months in this valley. She could hear the distant lowing of the Henderson cattle being brought in for the night, and somewhere across the valley someone was splitting wood, the sharp crack echoing off the mountain walls like rifle shots. As she turned to go back inside, a movement caught her eye near the tree line. At first, she thought it might be an elk or perhaps a bear preparing for hibernation, but as she watched, the shape resolved into something far more unsettling: a man on horseback, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to this wild place in ways she never would. Even from this distance, she could see his massive frame, the way he sat his horse as if they were one creature, and the deliberate pace of someone who had no doubt about his destination. Her heart began to pound with an instinct as old as humanity itself, the recognition of something both dangerous and magnetic approaching through the gathering darkness. She had heard whispers about the mountain men who lived in the highest reaches, men who had turned their backs on civilization and embraced a life as wild and untamed as the bears they sometimes fought, with nothing but knives and determination. They were spoken of in hushed tones around fireplaces, figures more legend than reality, ghosts who emerged from the wilderness only when desperation or desire drove them down from their solitary peaks. But this man was no ghost. As he drew closer, she could make out the details that marked him as flesh and blood: the steam of his horse's breath in the cold air, the creak of leather, the soft jingle of metal gear. He rode with purpose, his gaze fixed steadily on her schoolhouse, and she realized with a mixture of terror and inexplicable anticipation that she was his destination. Her hand tightened on the satchel, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Inside were the remnants of a life built on propriety and predictability, a life where men approached with calling cards and proper introductions. But this was not Philadelphia, and the man riding toward her through the Montana twilight carried himself like someone who had never heard of such civilized conventions, and wouldn't care if he had. The first drops of freezing rain began to fall as the horseman emerged from the shadows of the pine trees, and Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. He was even larger than she had imagined, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her frozen in place. They were the color of winter storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel as exposed as if she stood naked in the mountain wind. "Miss Hartford," his voice carried easily across the distance between them, deep and rough as wind through canyon walls. It wasn't a question. She forced herself to stand straighter, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "I am. And you are?" He swung down from his horse with fluid grace despite his size, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath her feet. Silas McGraw. Folks call me Grizzly. The nickname fit him perfectly. Everything about the man spoke of raw, untamed power barely held in check. His clothing was a mixture of buckskin and homespun wool, practical and worn but well-maintained. A rifle rested across his back, and she could see the handles of various knives and tools protruding from his belt. But it was his hands that drew her attention. Massive, scarred, and calloused from decades of hard living, yet they held his horses, reins with surprising gentleness. "What brings you down from the mountains, Mr. McGraw?" She proud that her voice remained steady, despite the trembling in her knees. The rain was falling harder now, and she could see the storm building in the darkening sky above the peaks. He must have seen it too, because his gaze flicked upward before returning to her face with that unsettling intensity. "You," he said simply. The word hung between them like the first rumble of an avalanche. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face, and she took an involuntary step backward toward the schoolhouse door. "I beg your pardon." He moved closer, leading his horse, and she caught his scent on the wind, wood smoke, leather, and something wild and masculine that made her pulse quicken in ways that both alarmed and confused her. "Winter's coming early this year. First snow. Be here inside a week." He gestured toward the peaks where clouds were gathering, like an army preparing for battle. "Man needs to make his choices before the passes close. I'm afraid I don't understand what this has to do with me." From inside his coat, he withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he unwrapped what appeared to be a carved wooden token. Even in the dim light, she could see it was beautiful, intricate, knotwork surrounding two intertwined figures, polished smooth by countless hands. "This belonged to my grandfather, and his grandfather before him. McGraw men have carried it for 3 generations, waiting for the right woman to give it to." He held it out toward her, and she could see his hands trembling slightly. The first sign of vulnerability she had glimpsed in this mountain giant. "Mr. McGraw, I think there's been some mistake." "No mistake." His voice cut through her protest like an axe through pine. "I've watched you, Miss Hartford, seen how you care for those children, how you've adapted to this hard country. You're strong enough to survive what's coming, brave enough to build something lasting in this wilderness." The rain was turning to sleet now, stinging her face and making her shiver in her thin wool dress. She should go inside, should end this bizarre encounter before it went any further. But something in his storm-gray eyes held her transfixed. "I've lived alone in these mountains for 15 years, he continued, his voice growing softer but no less intense. "Built myself a cabin that'll stand against anything nature can throw at it. Got enough supplies laid in to last through the worst. Winter, but a man can't live forever without leaving something behind, without passing on what he's learned." He took another step closer, and she could see the desperation beneath his controlled exterior, a loneliness so profound it made her own isolation seem like a brief inconvenience. "Before the first snow falls, you'll birth my heir." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her throat, and nearly stumbled over the schoolhouse steps. "You're mad," she whispered. "Maybe." His smile held no humor. "Mountain living'll do that to a man. But I'm not wrong about this, about you. You don't even know me." "I know enough." He began counting off on his fingers. "I know you came here alone, running from something back east. I know you've got the spine to face down a room full of wild mountain children and teach them to read. I know you split your own kindling and mend your own clothes and haven't shed a single tear where anyone could see, even though the loneliness eats at you like a cancer." Each observation felt like an arrow finding its mark. How long had he been watching her? How much had he seen? "I know you're afraid of the winter," he continued relentlessly. "And you should be. This cabin of yours won't hold against what's coming. You'll freeze before February, assuming the roof doesn't cave in from the snow load first." The sleet was coming down harder now, driven by a wind that cut through her dress like a blade. She was shivering uncontrollably, but whether from cold or shock, she couldn't say. "You're offering to take me up to your cabin as your—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word. "As my wife." The simple declaration carried the weight of absolute certainty. To share my life, bear my children, and build something that'll outlast both of us. This is preposterous. "I don't know you, you don't know me, and you certainly can't just announce that I'm going to bear your children like I'm some sort of broodmare." Thunder rumbled overhead, and his horse whickered nervously. Silas stroked the animal's neck with one of those impossibly gentle hands, while keeping his eyes fixed on her face. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm going about this all wrong. My ma would tan my hide if she knew I was talking to a lady like this." For the first time since he'd appeared, Eliza glimpsed something almost civilized beneath the wild exterior. The mention of his mother humanized him in a way that was somehow more unsettling than his earlier declarations. "But I don't have time for proper courting, Miss Hartford. Don't have time for Sunday visits and flower bouquets and all the pretty words that smooth the path to matrimony. Winter doesn't wait for anyone up here, and neither can I." Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face in stark black and white. In that brief, blazing moment, she saw past the beard and the wild hair to the man beneath, and was shocked to realize he was younger than she had thought, probably no more than 30. His weathered appearance spoke of hard living, not advanced age. "Come inside," she heard herself saying, "before we both catch our death." The words were out before she could stop them, born of ingrained courtesy and the practical recognition that they were about to be caught in a serious storm. But as soon as she spoke, she realized the implications of inviting a strange man into her home, especially one who had just announced his intention to make her his wife. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, much obliged. As he led his horse toward the small lean-to shelter beside the schoolhouse, Eliza fled inside, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what had just occurred. She had come west to escape unwanted male attention, only to find herself the object of the most outrageous proposal in the history of human courtship. But as she lit the oil lamp with shaking hands and listened to the storm building outside, she couldn't shake the memory of the desperation in his eyes, or the strange flutter of something that might have been excitement in her chest when he looked at her as if she were the answer to prayers she hadn't known he was praying. The storm, struck with the fury of something personal, as if the mountains themselves were angry at this intrusion of civilization into their domain. Eliza stood by the window, watching sheets of sleet turn to snow in the space of minutes, while behind her, Silas McGraw filled her small cabin with a presence that seemed to absorb all the available air. He had removed his hat and coat, hanging them carefully by the door, but even in stockinged feet, he moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to small spaces. Still, the cabin that had seemed cozy to her now felt impossibly cramped with his massive frame occupying it. "Coffee?" she asked, more to have something to do with her hands than from any real desire to play hostess to the man who had just announced his intention to father children with her. "That'd be kind of you." His voice was softer now, gentler, but it still seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his chest. She busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for the familiar ritual of measuring grounds and pumping water from the small hand pump beside her sink. The domestic normalcy of it helped settle her nerves somewhat. "How long have you been watching me?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "Since you arrived." He settled himself carefully into her single chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "Wasn't watching in any improper way," he added quickly. "Just keeping an eye on things, making sure you were safe." She turned to face him, coffee pot in hand. "Safe from what?" "Bears, mostly. They get bold this time of year, feeding up for winter. Wolves sometimes, though they generally leave folks alone. But there are men up in these mountains who've been alone too long, forgotten how to act civilized around a lady." The implication hung heavy between them, that he was protecting her from men who might do exactly what he had just proposed, albeit with less ceremony. "And you consider yourself civilized?" A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his rugged features into something almost boyish. "My ma raised me proper, taught me to remove my hat in the presence of a lady, say please and thank you, and never take what ain't freely given. Yet you announced that I would bear your children as if it were already decided." The smile faded, replaced by that intense seriousness that seemed to be his natural state. A man states his intentions clear. Doesn't mean he expects compliance without consent. From somewhere inside his shirt, he withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. With careful hands, he unwrapped what appeared to be a miniature cradle. No, bigger than her two hands could hold. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every joint perfect, every surface smooth as silk, carved from what looked like cherry wood. "Made this last winter," he said quietly, setting it on the small table between them. "Spent most of February working on it when the snow was too deep for hunting and too cold for anything but sitting by the fire." Eliza found herself drawn to the tiny cradle, despite her best intentions. The wood seemed to glow in the lamplight, and she could see where loving hands had polished it to perfection. Without thinking, she reached out to touch it, then pulled her hand back as if it were a live coal. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "Baby needs something soft to sleep in, safe." His fingers traced the curved rockers with infinite gentleness. "Been thinking about that a lot lately, about what a child needs. What a woman needs. Mr. McGraw, Silas, if we're going to be talking about such personal matters, seems like we should use given names." The presumption of it should have outraged her, but somehow it didn't. There was something disarmingly honest about his approach, as if he genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would object to his perfectly logical proposal. "Silas, then. You must understand how impossible this all sounds. I don't know you, you don't know me. People don't just decide to have children together based on a conversation and a storm. They do up here." He leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees. "Frontier doesn't leave much room for the niceties. When you find something worth having, something that might not be there tomorrow, you don't waste time with ceremony." Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry, rattling the windows in their frames. The sound seemed to emphasize his point about the urgency of life in this harsh place. "Tell me about yourself," she said, settling into the chair, across from him with her own cup of coffee. "If you expect me to consider this arrangement, I should know something about the man making the proposal." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Born in these mountains. Pa was a trapper, came out here in 32 to get away from civilization. Met my ma when she was traveling with a wagon train. Their guide got them lost, and Pa found them half-starved in a box canyon. Ma was the prettiest thing he'd ever seen, he used to say. Talked her into staying. Did she regret it? Some days, I think, especially during the hard winters. But she loved him something fierce, and she loved this land almost as much. Taught me to read from the Bible, made sure I knew my letters and numbers, said just because we lived wild didn't mean we had to be ignorant." The coffee was hot and strong, warming her from the inside out. She found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested despite the bizarre circumstances. "What happened to them?" "Avalanche took them both when I was 16. I was out checking trap lines. Came home to find half the mountain had come down on. Oh, cabin." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Dug for 3 days before I accepted they were gone. I'm sorry. Long time ago now." But she could see the pain was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. "Point is, I know what it means to build a life with someone in this country. Watch my parents do it for 16 years. It's not easy, but it's worth doing right." Thunder. crashed overhead, and a gust of wind sent snow spiraling past the window. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Eliza realized, with a mixture of alarm and something else she didn't want to examine too closely, that Silas would be spending the night in her cabin. "You can't travel in this," she said. "No storm. Like this, a man could get turned around 10 feet from his own front door. I'll bed down by your fire if that's acceptable. Won't trouble you none." The propriety of the situation should have scandalized her. An unmarried woman alone with a strange man overnight. It was the sort of thing that would have ruined her reputation permanently back in Philadelphia. But Philadelphia felt like another world, another lifetime, and the rules that had governed her life there seemed as insubstantial as morning mist in the face of mountain reality. "There are blankets in the chest," she heard herself saying, "and I think there's enough stew left for 2, as if her words had summoned it. Her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. Silas's mouth quirked upward in what might have been amusement. "I've got fresh meat in my saddlebags. Took a deer this morning. If you don't mind the company, I'll cook us something proper." The offer was both practical and intimate, sharing a meal she hadn't prepared in her own home with a man who had announced his intention to make her his wife. Every rule of proper behavior she had ever learned screamed warnings, but the promise of fresh meat after weeks of salt pork and beans was too tempting to refuse. "That would be welcome," she admitted. As he rose to retrieve his supplies, the tiny cradle caught the lamplight again, seeming to glow with possibilities she wasn't ready to consider. But she couldn't deny the strange flutter in her chest when she looked at it, or the way her treacherous imagination had already begun to picture a tiny face peering up from its carefully crafted depths. The venison was the best meal Eliza had tasted since leaving Philadelphia. Silas proved surprisingly adept in her small kitchen, moving with the efficient grace of someone long accustomed to cooking for himself. He seasoned the meat with wild herbs from a pouch at his belt, filling the cabin with aromas that spoke of pine forests and mountain meadows. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked, savoring another bite. "Ma, mostly, but 15 years of cooking for myself taught me the rest." He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "A man learns to appreciate good food when he's spent enough. Nights gnawing on jerky and wondering if he'll see another hot meal." They ate mostly in comfortable silence, the storm providing a steady backdrop of wind and driving snow. Eliza found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest, noting details she had missed in the drama of their first encounter. His hands, despite their size and obvious strength, handled her delicate china with surprising care. His table. Manners were rough but not uncouth, the habits of someone taught properly but long out of practice with civilized company. "Tell me about your family," he said suddenly, startling her from her observations. "My family?" She set down her fork. Her appetite suddenly diminished. "What would you like to know? Whatever you're willing to share. A man should know something about the woman he hopes to marry." The casual way he said it, as if their marriage were a foregone conclusion rather than the wild fantasy of a mountain hermit, should have infuriated her. Instead, she found herself oddly touched by his certainty. "My father was a banker. My mother came from old Philadelphia society, the kind where bloodlines matter more than character." She traced the rim of her water glass with one finger. "They had very specific plans for my future. Marriage to the right sort of man, children who would carry on the family name, a life of proper social obligations. But you came here instead. I came here to escape a marriage to Charles Pemberton III, heir to a shipping fortune and the most boring man God ever created." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She thought she had buried those feelings months ago. "He proposed on schedule, exactly as our parents had arranged. Everyone expected me to be grateful for the honor." From inside her dress, she withdrew a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother, opening it to reveal a photograph of a severe-looking couple standing stiffly beside a young woman in an elaborate dress. "My parents," she explained, noting how Silas studied the image with genuine interest. Taken at my sister Margaret's wedding, they expected the same from me, a proper match, a proper life, proper children raised by proper nurses. But you wanted something different. I wanted to choose my own path, to do something meaningful with my life, instead of simply decorating someone else's parlor. She snapped the locket closed. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in the Montana Territory, it seemed like providence. A chance to be useful, to make a difference. And have you made a difference? The question was asked without mockery, with genuine curiosity about her answer. She considered it seriously, thinking of her students and their eager faces, their pride when they mastered. A difficult lesson. I think so. I hope so. These children deserve every opportunity to better themselves, even out here in the wilderness. They're lucky to have you. The simple sincerity in his voice warmed her more than the coffee or the fire. When was the last time someone had told her she was valued for her mind, her skills, rather than her potential as an ornament or broodmare? What about you? She asked. 15 years alone in the mountains. That's a long time. Have you never wanted company before? Now? His expression grew thoughtful, almost distant. Oh, I've wanted it. But wanting and finding are different things. Women don't generally choose this life willingly. The few who come west are usually already spoken for, or they're looking for something softer than what these mountains offer. So why me? What makes you think I'm different? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but certain. Watched you that first week you were here. Saw you split kindling with blisters on your hands, then teach those children their letters without complaint. Saw you help birth the Henderson baby when their regular midwife couldn't make it through the pass. Saw you give half your winter supplies to the widow McAllister when her husband died. Each observation hit her like a small shock. She had thought herself unobserved during those early struggles, had prided herself on maintaining dignity despite the hardships. You don't just survive out here, he continued. You adapt. You find ways to thrive. That takes a special kind of strength, or a special kind of stubbornness. He smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered features. Same thing in my experience. The wind outside seemed to be lessening, though the snow continued to fall steadily. By morning, they would likely be snowed in completely, a thought that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. The children will worry if I don't have school tomorrow, she said. Parents won't send them out in weather like this. Mountain folk know better. You seem to know a great deal about everyone in the valley. Part of staying alive up here. A man needs to know his neighbors, even if he doesn't socialize with them much. She studied his profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the way his eyes reflected the flames. Don't you ever get lonely? Every day. The admission was so quiet she almost missed it. But loneliness is better than settling for the wrong person. Least, that's what I told myself. For 15 years. And now? He turned to look at her directly, his storm-grey eyes serious. Now I think maybe I've been waiting for the right person to come along. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. There was no doubt he meant her, no question about his sincerity. The sheer certainty of it was both thrilling and terrifying. Silas, she faltered, unsure how to voice the tangle of emotions his presence had stirred up. I know it's a lot to consider, he said gently. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just asking you to think about it, about what kind of life we might build together. From his shirt pocket he withdrew something else, a small wooden figure, carved with the same exquisite skill as the cradle. It was a woman reading to a child, the details so fine she could see the tiny book in the woman's hands, the curl of the child's hair. Made this one too, he said, setting it beside the cradle. Kept thinking about what you do, how important it is. Thought maybe, if we had children, you could teach them the way you teach the valley children. The carved figure seemed to glow in the lamplight, a vision of domesticity so perfect it made her heart ache. She could see herself in those tiny features, could imagine the children they might create together, could picture the life he was offering with startling clarity. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Could be real," he said softly, "if you're brave enough to want it." Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them into this small pocket of warmth and possibility. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Eliza Hartford found herself thinking not about the life she had left behind, but about the life she might choose to build. Eliza woke to silence so complete. It felt solid, like cotton stuffed in her ears. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind the peculiar hush that only comes with deep snow. Through her frost-covered window, she could see that the world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. Drifts that reached nearly to the eaves, trees bent under the weight of white, the familiar landscape rendered unrecognizable. From the main room came the soft sounds of someone moving carefully, trying not to wake her. She rose and dressed quickly, her breath visible in the cold air despite the banked fire. When she emerged from her small bedroom, she found Silas crouched beside the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. "Morning," he said without turning, around as if he had sensed her presence. "Storm left us with about 4 feet. We're not going anywhere for a while." The matter-of-fact way he said it sent a flutter of something through her chest. Panic, perhaps, or excitement. She couldn't be sure which. How long is a while? Depends on the wind. If it stays calm, maybe 3 days for the main paths to become passable. If it picks up and starts drifting, he shrugged, feeding kindling to the growing flames. Could be a week, alone with him in her small cabin, far from any possibility of rescue or scandal or the judgment of others. The thought should have terrified her, but as she watched his capable hands tend the fire, she found herself strangely calm. "I should check my supplies," she said. "Make sure we have enough." "Already did." He rose and turned to face her, and she was struck again by his sheer size in the confined space. "You've got enough flour and beans to last, if we're careful. Coffee might run short, but I've got some in my saddlebags. We'll make do." The casual way he included himself in her provisions, in her plans, should have annoyed her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. When had she last had someone else worry about practical matters? "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded and moved toward the door. "I'll see to my horse, then dig us a path to the necessary. Snow's too deep right now for much else." After he left, Eliza stood at the window watching him work. Even in the deep snow, he moved with efficiency and purpose, carving a narrow path with what appeared to be a homemade wooden shovel. Steam rose from his body in the cold air, and she found herself studying the powerful play of muscles beneath his heavy coat. The domesticity of it struck her suddenly, watching a man work in her yard, knowing he would come back inside to share breakfast with her, having someone else shoulder the burden of winter survival. It was what she might have had with Charles Pemberton if she had chosen that safe, predictable path. But watching Silas work, she couldn't imagine Charles lasting. 5 minutes in conditions like these. A distant howling made her freeze at the window. It came again, closer this time, and she saw Silas straighten from his shoveling, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle across his back. Wolves. She had heard them before, of course, echoing across the valley in the early morning or late evening. But they had always sounded far away, more like the voices of the mountains themselves than any immediate threat. This was different. This was the sound of hunger, and it was getting closer. Silas appeared at her door moments later, stamping snow from his boots. "Pack of wolves came down from the high country," he said without preamble. "Storm probably drove them lower, looking for easier hunting. They won't bother us as long as we stay inside," but the howling came again, much closer now, and was answered by other voices from different directions. Eliza felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as she realized they were surrounded. "How many?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. 5, maybe 6. Not a huge pack, but hungry enough to be bold. He moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the frost. They're probably more interested in my horse than us, but wolves can be unpredictable when they're desperate. As if summoned by his words, a large grey shape appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving with the liquid grace of a predator. It was followed by another, and another, until Eliza could count 5 wolves circling the small cabin like sharks around a sinking ship. "They're beautiful," she whispered, despite her fear. Silas glanced at her in surprise. "Most folks just see the danger. I can see that too. But look at them. The way they move together, the intelligence in their eyes. They're magnificent." One of the wolves, larger than the others, and with a distinctive white patch on its chest, paused directly in front of the window. For a moment its yellow eyes seemed to meet Eliza's through the glass, and she felt a strange connection to this wild creature that lived by its own rules, following instincts older than civilization. "The lead female," Silas said softly. "She's deciding whether we're worth the trouble." "What will she decide?" "Depends on how hungry they are and how much they want my horse." A crash from outside made them both jump. Through the window, they could see that one of the wolves had knocked over Eliza's woodpile, scattering split logs across the snow. The action seemed to energize the pack, and suddenly they were all moving, circling, testing, looking for weaknesses. "They're getting bolder," Silas observed. "That's not good." From his coat he withdrew what appeared to be a large piece of wolf hide, grey and thick, and obviously well tanned. Without explaining, he draped it around Eliza's shoulders, pulling it close, around her like a cloak. "What are you doing?" "Something my pa taught me. Wolves respect their own kind, even when they're dead." His hands were gentle as he arranged the hide, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. "If they catch your scent mixed with wolf scent, it might confuse them enough to make them think twice." The hide was surprisingly warm and soft, and it carried a wild, musky scent that seemed to transport her directly into the wilderness. Wrapped in it, she felt transformed, as if she had shed her civilized skin and become something more primal. Will it work? Maybe. Wolves are smart, but they're also cautious. Anything that doesn't fit their understanding of the world makes them nervous. One of the younger wolves had approached the lean-to where Silas's horse was sheltered. The animal was clearly agitated, snorting and pawing at the snow, but the structure held firm against its struggles. "I have to go out there," Silas said suddenly. "What? No!" The words burst from her before she could stop them. "You can't go out there alone against 5 wolves. Horse won't last long if they decide to test that shelter. And if they kill my horse, we're trapped here until spring." He was already checking his rifle, his movements calm and methodical. "Besides, I've dealt with wolves before." "How?" Carefully, he looked at her seriously. "I need you to bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anything until I come back and call your name. If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you." The fierce certainty in her voice surprised them both. She hadn't realized how much the thought of losing him frightened her until the words were out of her mouth. He studied her face for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek with one gentle finger. "You starting to care about this old mountain man?" "You're not old," she said, instead of answering his real question. His smile was soft and warm. "I'll be back. Promise." As he prepared to step out into the snow and face down a pack of hungry wolves, Eliza pulled the wolf hide closer around her shoulders and discovered that somewhere in the space of 2 days, the wild had begun to feel less like a threat and more like home. The confrontation with the wolves lasted only minutes, but to Eliza, pressed against the window and wrapped in the wolf hide, it felt like hours. She watched Silas emerge from the cabin with deliberate slowness, his rifle ready but not raised, his movements calm and non-threatening. The lead female immediately focused on him, her ears pricked forward, testing this new element in her environment. What happened next defied everything Eliza thought she knew about wild animals and human interaction. Instead of charging or retreating, Silas began to make low, rumbling sounds in his throat, not quite growls, but something that seemed to communicate in the wolf's own language. The lead female tilted her head, listening, and the rest of the pack grew still for several long moments. Man and wolf studied each other across the snow-covered clearing. Then, incredibly, the female took a step back. It wasn't retreat exactly, but acknowledgement. The pack's posture shifted subtly, tension easing as their leader made some decision that only she understood. One by one, they began to fade back into the tree line, moving like grey shadows until only the white-chested female remained. She held Silas's gaze for another heartbeat, then turned and disappeared into the pines, leaving behind only tracks in the snow and the lingering sense of something profound having passed between predator and man. Silas remained motionless for several minutes longer, waiting to be sure they were truly gone before returning to the cabin. When he finally came inside, Eliza was trembling, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of what she had witnessed. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Respect," he said simply, hanging up his coat. "Wolves understand respect. Show them you're not prey, but you're not challenging their authority either, and they'll usually move on to easier hunting. You've done that before, a few times. Living alone up here, you learn to read the signs, understand the language of things that don't use words." He moved to the fire, stirring the coals back to life. Wolves aren't so different from people, really. They want to survive, protect their own, find enough food to make it through another day. Eliza was still wrapped in the wolf hide, and she found herself reluctant to remove it. There was something about wearing the skin of a wild creature, about having witnessed Silas's communion with the pack, that made her feel as if she had crossed some invisible boundary between civilization and wilderness. "Is that what you're doing? Trying to survive? Protect your own?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the loneliness that lived behind his storm-grey eyes, a loneliness so deep it made her own isolation seem like a minor inconvenience. "I spent 15 years learning to survive alone," he said quietly. "Now I'm trying to learn how to survive with someone else." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. She had been so focused on the presumption of his proposal, the audacity of his declaration, that she hadn't truly considered the courage it must have taken for a man who had lived in isolation for half his life to reach out to another human being. "Why me?" she asked again, but this time the question held different weight. "Really? Why me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "First time I saw you, you were outside the schoolhouse trying to fix a loose shutter in the wind. Board was too heavy for you, kept slipping, but you didn't give up. Must have tried 20 times before you got it right." He glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Most folks would have waited for help, or left it broken. You just kept trying." "That's hardly romantic," she said, but she found herself smiling despite everything. "Romance is for people who have time for pretty lies. What I saw was character, determination, the kind of strength that builds lasting things." He moved to the table where the carved cradle and the small figure still sat, touching each with reverent fingers. "I've been alone so long, I forgot what it felt like to want something beyond just making it through another winter. Then I watched you with those children, saw how you cared for them, how you made them feel important and valued, and I remembered. What it felt like to want a family. To want someone to share the sunrise with, someone to talk to besides the wind and the trees." His voice grew softer. "Someone to love." The word hung between them like a bridge neither had quite expected to cross. Love. He hadn't mentioned it. Before, had talked about heirs and survival and practical arrangements, but not love. "You don't know me well enough to love me," she said, but without conviction. "Don't I?" He turned to face her fully. "I know you're brave enough to travel 2,000 miles alone to start a new life. I know you're kind enough to give away your own supplies to help a neighbor. I know you're strong enough to split kindling with blistered hands and smart enough to teach children to read by lamplight. He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. I know you're beautiful in ways that go deeper than just what a man sees on the surface. And I know that when you thought those wolves might hurt me, you were afraid in a way that told me you've started to care about this old mountain man, whether you want to admit it or not. The wolf hide around her shoulders felt warm and alive, like armor against the vulnerability of his words, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. Somewhere between his shocking declaration and his gentle care of her delicate china, between his stories of his parents and his courage in facing down the wolf pack, she had begun to care about Silas McGraw. I am afraid, she admitted quietly, of me. Of what you represent, of choosing a life so far outside everything I was raised to expect. She pulled the hide closer around herself. Of caring about someone who lives with death as close as you do. Death's close to everyone, Eliza. Difference is, up here we're honest about it. We don't pretend we've got forever to make our choices. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew something she hadn't seen before, a small bundle of dried wildflowers. Their colors faded, but their shapes still recognizable. Mountain lupine, Indian paintbrush, glacier lilies. The kind of flowers that grew only in the highest meadows, where the air was thin and the growing season lasted just a few precious weeks. Picked these last summer, he said almost shyly. Kept thinking maybe someday I'd have reason to give. Flowers to a lady. The gesture was so sweetly awkward, so unlike his usual confidence, that it made her heart skip. Here was this giant of a man who could face down wolves and survive alone in the wilderness, made uncertain by the simple act of offering flowers to a woman. They're lovely, she said, accepting the bundle with hands that trembled slightly. Not as lovely as you. The compliment, delivered with such simple sincerity, made her blush like a schoolgirl. When had a man last made her feel beautiful? When had anyone made her feel as valued, as seen, as Silas McGraw had in the space of 2 days? Outside, the wind began to pick up again, sending snow spiraling past the windows. The sound reminded them both that they were still trapped together, still isolated from the rest of the world by forces beyond their control. Storm's coming back, Silas observed, moving to check the fire. How can you tell? Winds shifted, picking up speed. We'll likely get another foot before morning. Another night together, another day of forced intimacy in the small cabin. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead she found herself looking forward to more conversations by the fire, more glimpses into the complex man who had disrupted her carefully ordered life. Silas, she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness, if I were to consider your proposal, and I'm not saying I am, but if I were, what exactly would you expect from me? He turned from the fire, his expression serious but gentle. Partnership. Someone to share the load of surviving up here. Someone to talk to during the long winter nights. Someone to build something lasting with. And children? If God blesses. Us with them, yes, but not right away. Not until you're ready, until we've had time to know each other properly. He paused. I know how that sounded when I first said it, like I was demanding something I had no right to expect. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? I meant that life is short and uncertain up here, and when you find someone worth building a future with, you don't waste time pretending otherwise. His storm-grey eyes met hers steadily. I meant that I want to love you, Eliza Hartford. Want to spend whatever time I have left learning how to make you happy. The dried flowers in her hands seemed to pulse with life, carrying the scent of high mountain meadows and endless summer days. Outside, the wind sang through the pines like a lullaby, and the fire crackled with warmth and promise. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Eliza began to seriously consider the possibility that the life she had been running toward might be standing right in front of her, wearing the face of a mountain man who carved cradles by his lonely fire and picked wildflowers for a woman he barely knew but somehow understood better than anyone ever had. The third morning dawned clear and cold, with sunlight so brilliant on the snow that it hurt to look directly at it. The paths were finally passable, though still treacherous, and Silas began preparing for his departure back to his mountain cabin. Eliza told herself she was relieved that their forced intimacy was coming to an end, but the hollow feeling in her chest suggested otherwise. She was folding the wolf hide that had become like a second skin to her when something fell from its folds, a small rectangular object wrapped in oiled cloth. Curious, she unwrapped it carefully, then froze as she realized what she was holding. It was a daguerreotype, the kind wealthy families commission to mark important occasions. The image showed a young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair and gentle eyes, wearing a wedding dress that had obviously cost more than most people earned in a year. She was beautiful in a delicate, ethereal way that made Eliza's heart sink with sudden understanding. But it was the man standing beside the bride that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably Silas McGraw. His arm was around the woman's waist, and his face wore an expression of such pure joy and love that it was painful to witness. "Eliza, you all right?" Silas had entered the cabin without her. Noticing his arms full of gear from his horse, she turned to face him, the daguerreotype clutched in her trembling hands. "Who is she?" The blood drained from his face as he saw what she held. For a moment he looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, paralyzed by shock and guilt. "Where did you find that?" "It fell from the wolf hide." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. "Who is she, Silas?" He set down his gear with exaggerated care, buying himself time. But when he finally met her eyes, she saw the truth written across his features like words carved in stone. Her name was Catherine McGraw. The words came out like a confession torn from his soul. "My wife." The simple statement hit Eliza like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, the daguerreotype still clutched in her hands, staring at the evidence of everything she had been too naive to consider. "Your wife," she repeated numbly, "was. She's been dead 3 years now." Dead. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. "And you didn't think to mention this small detail when you were proposing that I bear your children." He flinched as if she had struck him. "It's not what you think, isn't it?" She stood up abruptly, fury and hurt warring in her chest. "Let me guess. You loved her desperately. She died tragically. And now you need a replacement to help you forget your pain. Is that close enough?" "No." His voice was rough with old grief. "Yes, both." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of desperation she had never seen from him before. "It's complicated, then uncomplicate it." She held up the daguerreotype, forcing herself to study the radiant face of the dead woman. "Tell me about Catherine McGraw. Tell me about the woman whose place you expect me to take." He was quiet for so long, she thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully guarded pain. "Met her. In Denver. I'd come down from the mountains to sell furs, buy supplies for winter. She was there with her father. He owned a big mining operation, had interests in half the territory. She was everything I wasn't. Educated, refined, beautiful in a way that made men stop in the street just to look at her." Eliza forced herself to keep looking at the photograph, noting details she had missed in her initial shock. The woman's dress alone would have cost more than a teacher's annual salary. Her posture spoke of finishing schools and dancing masters, of a life lived far from any hardship or uncertainty. What was she doing in Denver? Her father was expanding his operations, looking at new claims in the mountains. She came along too. Keep him company, see the West before settling down to marry some banker's son back in St. Louis. But she married you instead. She said she fell in love with the wilderness, with the idea of a life lived free from society's expectations. His smile held no warmth. Turned out loving the idea of something and living with the reality of it are two different things. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What happened?" "I built her a cabin." not the rough place I'd been living in, but something worthy of a lady. Brought in furniture from Denver, glass windows, everything I thought she'd need to be happy. For a while it worked. She seemed content, even excited about our new life together. He moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had been his domain for so many years. First winter was hard on her, harder than I expected. She wasn't used to the isolation, the constant cold, the way the mountains can make you feel like the last person on earth. By spring, she was talking about visiting her father in Denver, just for a few weeks, she said, just to see some familiar faces. Did she go? No. The word came out like a gunshot. She found out she was carrying our child, said she couldn't travel in her condition, couldn't risk the baby. She seemed happy about it, excited even. Talked about how our child would be born free, would grow, up strong and independent in the mountains. Eliza's hands tightened on the daguerreotype. She could see where this story was heading, could feel the approaching tragedy like a storm on the horizon. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. She was small, delicate, not built for the kind of hardships that mountain life demands. I should have taken her down to Denver, should have insisted she have the baby where there were doctors, proper medical care, but you didn't. She wouldn't go. Said she wanted our child born in our home, in the mountains where we'd build our life together. Said it would be bad luck to leave, that the baby belonged to the wilderness just like we did. His voice grew quieter, more strained. Labor lasted 2 days. 2 days of her fighting to bring our child into the world, while I stood by helpless, watching her grow weaker with every hour. There was nothing I could do, no way to help her, no one to call for assistance. Eliza found herself holding her breath, dreading the words she knew were coming. She died just after dawn on the 3rd day. Our son, his voice broke completely. Our son lived for maybe an hour, just long enough for me to hold him, to see his face, to know what I'd lost. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza stared at the photograph through eyes blurred with tears, seeing now not a rival for Silas's affections, but a tragedy so profound it had shaped everything that came after. I buried them together in a meadow she loved, where the wildflowers bloom every spring. Spent the next 3 years blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have saved them. He turned from the window to face her, and she saw that his cheeks were wet with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. When I made that declaration about you bearing my heir, it wasn't because I thought you were replaceable, Eliza. It was because for the first time in 3 years, I'd found someone strong enough to survive what Catherine couldn't. Someone who could build a life in these mountains and thrive, not just endure. The daguerreotype trembled in her hands as the full weight of his words sank in. He hadn't been looking for a wife. He'd been looking for a survivor, someone who could succeed where his first love had failed. So I'm not supposed to replace her, she said quietly. I'm supposed to surpass her. The accuracy of her observation hit him like a physical blow. That's not... I didn't mean... Didn't you? She set the photograph on the table with exaggerated care. You've spent 3 years mourning a woman who couldn't handle the life you offered. Now you've found someone you think is tough enough to survive it, and you've convinced yourself that makes it love. It is love. The words burst from him with desperate intensity. What I feel for you is hope, she finished. Hope that this time will be different. Hope that you can finally have the family you want without losing it to the mountains. She stood up, suddenly needing distance from him, from the photograph, from the weight of expectations she was only beginning to understand. But what if you're wrong, Silas? What if I'm not as strong as you think? What if I can't give you what Catherine couldn't? What then? He had no answer for that, and his silence was more devastating than any words could have been, because they both knew the truth now, that his proposal hadn't been born of love at first sight, but of desperate need and hard-learned pragmatism. He had chosen her not for who she was, but for who he hoped she might prove to be, and Eliza Hartford, who had fled one life built on others' expectations, found herself facing another that might be just as confining, just as impossible to escape. Revelation hung between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Silas gathered his belongings in heavy silence while Eliza stood at the window, watching the sun climb higher over the pristine snow. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but the world felt fundamentally altered, as if the foundations of reality had shifted beneath her feet. "I should go," Silas said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," she agreed, not turning from the window. "You should." She heard him move toward the door, then stop. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. When he finally broke the silence, his words came out rough and uneven. "Eliza, I don't." She still couldn't look at him. "Whatever you're about to say, just don't. I need time to think." "How much time?" The question carried weight they both understood. Winter was closing in, and with it, the long months of isolation that would determine not just her survival, but the shape of her future. If she was going to make a choice about Silas's proposal, it couldn't wait until spring. "I don't know," she said honestly. After he left, the cabin felt impossibly empty. Eliza found herself touching things he had handled. The coffee cup he'd drunk from, the chair where he'd sat by the fire, the wolf hide that still carried his scent. The carved cradle and wooden figures remained on her table like silent witnesses to promises that might never be fulfilled. She tried to return to her normal routine, but everything felt hollow. Teaching seemed pointless when she might not be here much longer. Planning for winter felt absurd when she didn't know where, or with whom, she might be spending it. Even reading held no appeal, the words swimming meaninglessly across the pages. 3 days passed in this suspended state before circumstance forced her hand. She was splitting kindling behind the schoolhouse when she heard the sound. A human voice, calling weakly from somewhere across the valley. At first, she thought she might be imagining it, but it came again, more urgent this time. Grabbing her heavy coat and the medical supplies she kept for emergencies with her students, she followed the sound toward the tree line. What she found there made her heart race with alarm. A man lay crumpled against a fallen log, his clothes torn and bloody, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't from any of the local families, but his expensive clothing and soft hands marked him as someone from back east, someone completely unprepared for mountain wilderness. "Help me!" he gasped when he saw her approaching. "Please, my leg!" The leg in question was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle that made her stomach turn. But worse than the injury was his condition, hypothermic, dehydrated and showing signs of infection from wounds that appeared to be several days old. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him and pulling a blanket from her supply bag. "Hunting trip, got separated from my guide, horse threw me." The words came in painful bursts. "Been crawling for 2 days trying to find help." Eliza's mind raced through her options. The man needed medical attention beyond anything she could provide, but the nearest doctor was in Copper Falls, a 3-day ride even in good conditions. In his current state, he might not survive the journey, but there was someone closer who might be able to help. "I'm going to get you to shelter," she told the injured man. "Then I'm going to bring someone who knows about setting bones and treating wounds." Getting him back to the schoolhouse was a nightmare of careful maneuvering and suppressed cries of pain. By the time she had him settled by her fire, wrapped in every blanket she owned, Eliza knew she was facing a life-or-death situation that was beyond her capabilities to handle alone. She needed Silas. The realization came with a mixture of relief and trepidation. After their confrontation about Catherine, she wasn't sure he would even come if she called. But this wasn't about their personal drama. This was about saving a man's life. The question was how to reach him. His cabin was somewhere high in the mountains, but she had no idea of the exact location. Even if she did, traveling alone into the high country to find him would be suicide. Then she remembered something from her first week in the valley, old Henrik Kowalski mentioning that the Mountain men had ways of communicating across long distances when necessary. Emergency signals that carried further than any human voice. The schoolhouse bell. It was a massive bronze thing brought in at great expense to call children to their lessons. But Henrik had mentioned that in emergencies it could be heard for miles, echoing off the mountain walls in patterns that conveyed specific meanings to those who knew how to read them. Eliza had no idea what patterns meant what, but she prayed that Silas would recognize the urgency of any signal coming from the valley and investigate. She began ringing the bell in steady, rhythmic tolls, pausing every few minutes to listen for any response. The sound rolled across the snow-covered landscape like thunder, bouncing off the peaks and returning to her in fading echoes. For an hour, she continued the desperate signal. Her arms ached, her ears rang, and still there was no sign that anyone had heard or understood her message. Then, just as she was beginning to despair, she heard it. The distant crack of a rifle shot, fired 3 times in quick succession. The sound came from high up the mountainside, from the direction of the tallest peaks. Silas had heard her. Within 2 hours, she spotted him riding hard down the mountain, pushing his horse through snow that would have challenged a lesser rider. He reached the schoolhouse as the sun was beginning to set, his face grim with worry. "What's wrong?" he asked before he was even fully dismounted. "Injured man. Broken leg, infection, hypothermia. He's been out there for days." She led him quickly inside, where the stranger lay semi-conscious by the fire. Silas took one look at the man's condition and began issuing rapid orders. "I need hot water, clean cloth, whiskey if you have it, and that sharp knife from your kitchen." For the next several hours, Eliza watched Silas work with a competence that took her breath away. He set the broken bone with surgical precision, cleaned and dressed wounds that had begun to fester, and administered doses of medicine from a kit she hadn't known he carried. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked during a brief break. "Necessity. Living alone in the mountains, you learn to doctor yourself or you die. I've set my own bones more than once." The injured man, who had introduced himself as James Whitmore from Chicago, was out of immediate danger by midnight, sleeping peacefully under the influence of laudanum from Silas's medical supplies. "He'll live," Silas said quietly, washing his hands in the basin. "Leg'll heal crooked, probably always limp, but he'll live. Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for what he had done. "I couldn't have saved him alone." "You did save him. I just helped with the details." They stood together in the lamplight, exhausted but bound together by the shared experience of fighting death and winning. The crisis had pushed aside their personal conflicts, forcing them to work as a team in ways that felt natural and right. "Silas," she said softly, "about what happened before, I know." He looked at her with eyes that held new understanding. "I know what it looked like, what it sounded like, and I know I handled it all wrong from the beginning." From his coat, he withdrew something she had never seen before, a ring carved from what appeared to be mountain stone, polished smooth and set with a small piece of gold that caught the lamplight. "Made this for Catherine," he said quietly. "Carved it from granite I took from the peak where we first kissed. Spent months getting it right, making it perfect for her." Eliza felt her heart sink. Even now, even after everything, he was still thinking about his dead wife. "But I never gave it to her," he continued, surprising her, "because by the time I finished it, I realized I'd been making it for the woman I wanted her to be, not the woman she actually was." He held the ring up to the light, turning it slowly so she could see the intricate carving that covered its surface. "Took me 3 years to understand that I'd made the same mistake with Catherine that I was about to make with you. I fell in love with my idea of who you could be, instead of learning to love who you actually are." He set the ring on the table, beside the carved cradle and wooden figures, completing a collection of hopes and dreams that might never be realized. "I don't know if you can forgive me for that. Don't know if you should. But I want you to know that when I watch you work to save a stranger's life, when I see you ring that bell until your arms shake because you're willing to ask for help when someone needs it, that's when I see who you really are. And that's the woman I want to spend my life learning to love properly. The honesty in his voice, the recognition of his own mistakes, hit her harder than any declaration of passion could have. This wasn't the mountain man who had announced his intentions with primitive certainty. This was a man who had looked honestly at his own flaws and was asking for the chance to do better. Outside, the first snow of the real winter had begun to fall, soft and silent and relentless. Time was running out for choices, for possibilities, for all the futures that hung between them like crystalline promises in the cold mountain air. The first real snow of winter began falling at dawn, fat, flakes that drifted down with the inevitability of fate itself. Eliza stood at the window watching it accumulate, knowing that each inch brought her closer to a decision she could no longer postpone. James Whitmore was stable, but would need weeks of care before he could travel, and Silas had volunteered to help her tend to him until spring, an arrangement that would trap all three of them together in the small cabin for months. "Storm's getting worse," Silas observed from behind her, his voice carefully neutral. They had been dancing around each other for 3 days, polite as strangers, while the weight of unspoken choices hung between them like a sword. How much worse? "This isn't just snow, Eliza. This is the big one, the storm that'll close the passes until spring. If I'm going to make it back to my cabin, I need to leave within the hour." The finality in his words made her turn from the window. He was already gathering his gear, moving with the efficient motions of a man accustomed to reading weather signs and acting accordingly. "What about Mr. Whitmore? He's past the worst of it. You can manage his care now, and I've left you enough laudanum to keep him comfortable." Silas paused in his packing. Unless... He didn't finish the sentence, but she knew what he was asking. Unless she chose to come with him. Unless she was ready to accept his proposal and trust her life to his mountain sanctuary. Before she could. Enter, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a rider approaching through the swirling snow, pushing his horse hard against the storm. As he drew closer, Eliza recognized young Tommy Henderson, one of her students. The boy practically fell from his horse in his haste to reach the door. "Miss Hartford, you got to come quick. Ma's having the baby and something's wrong." Eliza's blood turned to ice. Sarah Henderson had been expecting her 4th child, but the baby wasn't due for another month. A premature birth in the middle of a blizzard, with no doctor for miles. It was every frontier woman's nightmare. "How long has she been in labor?" Silas asked, already reaching for his medical kit. "Since yesterday morning. Pa sent me to fetch the midwife from Copper Falls, but the trail's snowed in. Can't get through." Tommy's young face was tight with fear. "Ma's screaming something awful, and Pa don't know what to do." Eliza looked at Silas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. This was exactly what had happened to Catherine. A difficult birth, no medical help available, a woman's life hanging in the balance, while those who loved her stood helpless. "We have to go," she said. "Eliza, the storm—" "I don't care about the storm." Her voice was fierce with determination. "Sarah Henderson is my neighbor. Her children are my students. I will not let her die because I was too afraid to ride through some snow." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Surprise, admiration, and something deeper that looked like love. Not for who she might become, but for who she was in this moment. "All right," he said quietly. "We go together." The ride to the Henderson homestead was a nightmare of wind and driving snow. Visibility was nearly zero, and only Silas's intimate knowledge of the terrain kept them on the trail. But beneath her, fear for Sarah and the bone-deep cold, Eliza felt something else, a fierce joy at riding beside this man into danger, united in purpose, choosing action over safety. They reached the Henderson cabin to find chaos. John Henderson met them at the door, his face haggard with exhaustion and terror. "She's been pushing for hours," he said without preamble. "Something ain't right. Baby's coming wrong and Sarah's bleeding." Inside, they found Sarah Henderson in the grip of a labor that had clearly gone wrong. She was grey with exhaustion, her nightgown soaked with sweat and blood, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Breech presentation," Silas diagnosed after a quick examination. "Baby's trying to come feet first. That's why she can't deliver." Eliza had assisted at births before. It was part of a frontier teacher's duties, but she had never seen anything like this. Sarah's previous 3 children had been born easily, with minimal complications. This was something else entirely. "Can you turn it?" she asked. "Maybe. It's dangerous for both mother and child, but—" He looked at Sarah's pale face, at the spreading stain on the sheets beneath her. "She'll die if we don't try." For the next hour, Eliza watched Silas work with a skill that spoke of hard-earned experience. His massive hands, so capable of violence when necessary, displayed impossible gentleness as he attempted to manipulate the unborn child into a safer position. Sarah screamed once, a sound that tore through the cabin like a knife, then fell ominously silent. "She's unconscious," John Henderson whispered, his voice breaking. "Is she—" "She's alive," Silas said grimly. "But we're running out of time. The baby's in distress and she's lost too much blood." Through the window, Eliza could see that the storm had intensified. Even if they could somehow get Sarah to a doctor, they would never make it through the passes in conditions like these. Whatever happened here would determine whether Sarah Henderson lived or died. "Tell me what to do," she said. Silas looked at her with something approaching reverence. "I need you to monitor her pulse while I try one more time to turn the baby. If her heart rate drops too low, we'll have to make some hard choices." Eliza pressed her fingers to Sarah's throat, feeling the flutter of life beneath pale skin. "It's weak but steady." "Good, John. I need you to hold her shoulders. This is going to hurt, even unconscious." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Eliza's life. She watched Silas work with desperate concentration, his face set in lines of fierce determination. Through her fingertips, she felt Sarah's pulse fluctuate wildly, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing to an alarming crawl. "Got it," Silas said suddenly. "Baby's turned. Now we wait and see if Sarah has enough strength left to finish this." As if responding to his words, Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and her body tensed with the return of active labor. But where before her contractions had been ineffective, now they carried the promise of progress. "Push, Sarah," Eliza urged, taking her friend's hand. "Your baby's coming now." The next few minutes blurred together in a haze of effort and prayer. Sarah found strength she shouldn't have had, pushing with a determination that spoke to the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Silas guided the delivery with hands that never trembled, even when the cabin shook from the wind outside. Then, cutting through the storm's howl like a bell, came the sharp cry of a newborn. "A girl," Silas announced, his voice rough with emotion. "A perfect little girl." He handed the squalling infant to Eliza, who wrapped her in clean blankets, while Silas tended to Sarah's immediate needs. The baby was small but vigorous, her lungs strong enough to make her displeasure at this cold new world abundantly clear. "Sarah?" John Henderson's voice was tight with fear as he looked at his wife's pale, still face. "She's sleeping," Silas said. "Gently. Lost a lot of blood, but she'll recover. She just needs rest and time to heal." As if to prove his words, Sarah's eyes opened again, focusing immediately on the bundle in Eliza's arms. "My baby," she whispered. "She's beautiful," Eliza said, placing the infant in her mother's arms. "Absolutely perfect." The moment of triumph was shattered by a tremendous crash from outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Through the window, they could see that the storm had brought down a massive pine tree, blocking the main trail back to the valley. "We're trapped," John said quietly. Silas moved to the window, studying the fallen tree and the continuing snowfall. That tree's too big to move without a team of horses and proper equipment. Trail's going to be blocked for days, maybe weeks. The implications hung heavy in the air. They were stranded at the Henderson homestead with a woman who had just given birth, a premature infant, 3 other children, and rapidly dwindling supplies. The schoolhouse bell, Eliza said suddenly. If I can get back there, I can signal for help. You can't travel in this, Silas said firmly. Visibility's down to nothing, and you'd freeze before you made it halfway. Then what do you suggest? Before he could answer, little Tommy Henderson spoke up from where he had been quietly tending the fire. There's another trail, he said. Old hunting path that goes around the backside of the mountain. Pa showed it to me last summer. It's longer, but it don't go through the pass where the tree fell. John Henderson nodded slowly. Boy's right. It's treacherous in good weather, damn near impossible in a storm, but it could be done by someone who knows these mountains well enough. All eyes turned to Silas. He stood silently for a long moment, weighing options that all carried deadly risks. I could make it to my cabin that way, he said finally. Get supplies, medical equipment, maybe bring back help when the weather clears. How long would you be gone? 2 days if the weather holds, a week if it doesn't. Eliza felt her heart clench at the thought of him facing that treacherous trail alone, in conditions that could kill even an experienced mountain man. But she also knew that without additional supplies and help, they might not all survive until spring. There's another option, she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. We could all go to Silas's cabin, together, once Sarah's strong enough to travel. The suggestion hung in the air, like a challenge thrown down before fate itself. It would mean abandoning her schoolhouse, her carefully maintained independence, her old life entirely. It would mean trusting not just her own survival to Silas McGraw, but the lives of an entire family. It would mean, finally and irrevocably, accepting his proposal. Eliza, Silas said softly, understanding immediately what she was offering. Looked around the cabin, at Sarah holding her newborn daughter, at John's worried face, at Tommy and his siblings huddled together by the fire. These people had become her family over the past months, and she would not abandon them when they needed her most. But more than that, looking at Silas, she realized that somewhere between his shocking declaration and this moment of crisis, she had fallen in love with the man he actually was. Not perfect, not without his ghosts and regrets, but capable of profound gentleness and unwavering courage when it mattered most. The schoolhouse bell would have to wait. This was her answer, delivered not in words, but in the choice to bind her fate to his when the stakes couldn't be higher. The silence that followed Eliza's proposal stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah Henderson looked up from her newborn daughter, her eyes bright with fever and exhaustion, but sharp with understanding. You're talking about leaving everything behind, Sarah said softly. Your teaching, your independence, your whole life here. I'm talking about choosing life over principle, Eliza replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. All our lives. John Henderson studied Silas with the measuring gaze of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Your cabin big enough for all of us? Strong enough to last through a hard winter? Built it to withstand anything these mountains could throw at it, Silas answered. 3 rooms, stone fireplace, root cellar stocked with enough supplies for 10 people. Sarah and the baby would be safe there. And come spring, John pressed. What then? We can't impose on your hospitality forever. Come spring, we figure out what comes next. Together. Silas looked directly at Eliza as he spoke. All of us. Tommy Henderson stepped forward, his young face set with determination beyond his years. Ma needs proper care, and the baby needs to stay warm. If Mr. McGraw's cabin can provide that better than here, then that's where we should go. From her position by the fire, 8-year-old Beth Henderson added her voice to the discussion. Miss Hartford, will you still teach us our letters if we go to the mountain? The question, asked with such innocent trust, nearly broke Eliza's heart. These children had already lost so much: their normal routine, their sense of security, their comfortable predictability of their frontier lives. Now they were facing the prospect of leaving their home for an uncertain future in the high mountains. "I'll teach you wherever we are," she promised. "That's what teachers do." Silas moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the storm reflected in his grey eyes. "Eliza, you need to be sure about this. Once we start up that mountain, there's no changing your mind until spring. And after tonight, after what we've been through together, I am sure." The words came out more firmly than she had expected. "I've been sure since I watched you save Sarah's life with your own hands, since I saw you risk everything to help people you barely know." She reached for the silver locket at her throat, the one that held her parents' photograph, and slowly removed it. For a moment, she held it in her palm, looking at this last tangible connection to her old life. "I've spent my whole life being afraid," she said quietly. "Afraid of disappointing my parents, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of trusting my own judgment. But tonight, watching you work, watching you care more about saving lives than protecting yourself, I realized I've been afraid of the wrong things." She set the locket on the table beside the carved cradle and wooden figures, adding her own offering to the collection of symbols that represented their possible future together. "I'm not afraid of the mountains," she continued. "I'm not afraid of the isolation or the hardship or even the danger. What I'm afraid of is spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to choose love over safety." Silas reached out with one gentle hand to touch her cheek. "You sure you're choosing love, not just survival?" "I'm choosing both." She turned her face into his palm, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "Because I've learned that with you, they're the same thing." The confession hung between them for a heartbeat before Silas pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that belied his massive frame. Against her ear, she heard him whisper words of gratitude and promise that were too private for anyone else to hear. "Well then," John Henderson said, breaking the spell with practical frontier pragmatism, "I guess we'd better start packing." The next few hours passed in a blur of organized chaos. While Sarah rested with her newborn, the rest of them gathered. Essential supplies, food, medicine, clothing, and the few precious personal items that represented home and identity. Eliza found herself working alongside Silas with an efficiency that spoke of deeper partnership, their movements coordinated as if they had been planning for this moment their entire lives. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, they prepared for the most dangerous journey any of them had ever attempted. Sarah was wrapped in every blanket they could spare, the baby tucked against her chest in a sling designed to keep them both warm. John and Silas had rigged a travois behind one of the horses to carry Sarah and the infant, while the rest of them would walk alongside, breaking trail through snow that reached their knees. "Ready?" Silas asked, his hand resting on Eliza's shoulder. She looked back at the Henderson cabin, at the life she was leaving behind, then at the faces of the people who were now her chosen family. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, she could see the outline of her schoolhouse, already half buried in snow. "Ready," she said. The journey up the mountain was everything Silas had warned them it would be, and worse. The trail was treacherous even in good weather, consisting of narrow ledges that hugged cliff faces and steep climbs that left them all gasping in the thin air, with fresh snow making every step uncertain and visibility limited to just a few yards. It became an exercise in pure faith. But as they climbed higher, something remarkable happened. The storm that had seemed so threatening began to break apart, revealing glimpses of blue sky and distant peaks bathed in morning sunlight. The wind died down to a whisper, and the snow that continued to fall became gentle rather than driving. "Look!" Beth Henderson called out, pointing ahead. Through the thinning clouds, they could see their destination. A cabin that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself, its log walls and stone chimney so perfectly integrated with the landscape that it appeared to have been there since the beginning of time. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line against the still air, promising warmth and safety and the end of their perilous journey. As they approached the cabin, Eliza could see why Silas had been so confident about its ability to shelter them. The structure was massive, built from logs that would have taken several men to move, with a roof designed to shed the heaviest snow loads and windows positioned to catch the maximum amount of available light. But it was the details that spoke. To the man who had built it, the carefully carved shutters, the flower boxes that would bloom with color in summer, the wide porch that invited contemplation of the mountain views. This wasn't just a survival shelter. It was a home built by someone who understood the difference between merely existing and truly living. "Welcome," Silas said simply as he helped Sarah down from the travois. "Welcome to your new home." As they crossed the threshold together, Eliza felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded coat. She was no longer the Philadelphia schoolteacher who had come west to escape an unwanted marriage. She was no longer the isolated frontier woman struggling to survive alone. She was Eliza McGraw, or would be, as soon as they could find someone to perform the ceremony. She was a woman who had chosen love and partnership, and the uncertain promise of building something lasting in the most unlikely place imaginable. And as Silas closed the cabin door behind them, sealing them all into this new life together, she felt the profound satisfaction of a choice made with complete certainty and no regrets. Spring came early to the high mountains that year, arriving with the sound of snowmelt rushing down granite channels and the return of birdsong to the towering pines. Eliza stood on the cabin's wide porch, one hand resting on her swelling belly, watching her husband split wood in the clearing below. Husband. Even after 3 months of marriage, the word still brought a smile to her lips. They had been wed by John Henderson, who had discovered an old commission as a justice of the peace that was still valid in the territory. The ceremony had been simple. Just the two of them, the Henderson family and James Whitmore, who had recovered enough to serve as witness before continuing his journey back east with tales of mountain hospitality that would probably grow in the telling. The baby she carried, their first child, was due with the summer's end, and unlike Catherine's pregnancy, this one felt blessed from the start. Eliza had adapted to mountain life with a resilience that surprised even Silas, her body growing strong from the physical demands of high-altitude living, her spirit thriving in the clear air and vast spaces. "Mama Eliza, look what I found!" Beth Henderson came running up the path, clutching something small and precious in her hands. The girl had taken to calling her Mama Eliza without any prompting, a title that filled Eliza's heart with warmth every time she heard it. "What is it, sweetheart?" Beth opened her hands to reveal a tiny, delicate flower, a glacier lily, one of the first to bloom each spring in the high meadows. Its white petals seemed to glow with inner light, a small miracle of beauty in this harsh landscape. "It means winter's really over," Beth explained with the seriousness of a child who had learned to read the mountain's moods. "Papa John says when the glacier lilies bloom, it's safe to plant the garden." From inside his shirt, Silas had found something he had been saving all winter, a small baby's shoe made of the softest leather and decorated with tiny glass beads in patterns that caught the light. It had belonged to Catherine's baby, the son who had lived for only an hour, but instead of a source of pain, it had become a symbol of hope. "Thought you might like to have this," he had said, placing it gently in Eliza's hands on the day she told him about their own expected child. "For luck, for remembering that some dreams do come true, even if they take longer than we expect." Now, watching Beth examine her flower with scientific intensity, Eliza thought about the strange paths that had brought them all to this moment. The injured stranger who had forced her to call for help, the blizzard that had trapped them together, Sarah's difficult labor that had revealed Silas's true character and her own capacity for courage. Each crisis had stripped away another layer of pretense and fear, until all that remained was the essential truth of who they were and what they meant to each other. "Eliza," Silas called from the woodpile, "you all right up there?" "Perfect," she called back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The Henderson family had decided to stay through the summer, helping to expand the cabin and establish the larger homestead that would be needed for their growing community. John had skills as a carpenter that complemented Silas's knowledge of mountain construction, and together they were building something that would last for generations. Tommy Henderson had become Silas's shadow, learning to track and hunt and read. The subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the wilderness. The boy had a natural aptitude for mountain life that reminded Eliza of how Silas must have been at that age. Confident, curious, and completely at home in places that would terrify most adults. Sarah's baby, named Grace for the miracle of her survival, was thriving in the mountain air. The premature infant, who had seemed so fragile during those first dangerous days, had grown into a robust child with her father's steady temperament and her mother's quick smile, and Eliza continued to teach, gathering the children around the great stone hearth each morning for lessons that now included not just reading and arithmetic, but the practical knowledge needed for mountain living, which plants were safe to eat, how to read weather signs, the proper way to preserve food for winter. It was, she realized, the education she had always wanted to provide, learning that prepared children not just for examinations, but for life itself. A letter had arrived with the last supply run before winter, forwarded through a chain of postal workers and friends who had tracked her to her mountain sanctuary. It was from her sister Margaret in Philadelphia, full of news about social events and eligible bachelors and gentle chiding about Eliza's continued absence from civilized society. "Mother and father ask about you constantly," Margaret had written. "They still hope you'll come to your senses and return home before you're completely ruined by this frontier adventure. Charles Pemberton asks after you as well. I believe he still hopes you might reconsider his proposal when you tire of playing schoolmarm." Eliza had read the letter twice, then used it to start the fire. The life her family described, the parties, and social obligations and careful management of reputation seemed as foreign to her now as tales from another planet. She was no longer the woman who had fled Philadelphia in desperation. She was someone entirely new, someone she liked much better. As evening approached, the family gathered around the dinner table, as had become their custom. Silas said grace, with the simple eloquence of a man who understood that every meal, every day, every breath was a gift not to be taken for granted. The children chatted about their discoveries and plans, their voices blending with the soft sounds of the mountain evening. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into their beds, Eliza and Silas sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the crystal-clear mountain air. The baby moved restlessly beneath her heart, as if eager to join this life they were building together. "Any regrets?" Silas asked softly, his arm around her shoulders. Eliza considered the question seriously, thinking about all the paths not taken, all the conventional choices she had rejected. Then she thought about the woman she had become, stronger, braver, more honest about her own desires and capabilities than she had ever been in her old life. "Only one," she said finally. Silas tensed slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to choose this life. To choose you." His arm tightened around her, and she felt his kiss against her temple, soft, grateful, full of promises for all the years to come. Below them, the valley stretched away toward distant peaks that glowed silver in the moonlight. Somewhere down there, her old schoolhouse sat empty, gradually being reclaimed by the wilderness. But here, in this high sanctuary they had built together, education continued in its truest form, the daily lessons of love, courage, and the endless human capacity for growth and change. The glacier lily Beth had found that morning sat in a glass of water on the windowsill, its pure white petals catching the lamplight. It would fade and die within days, as all beautiful things must. But it had served its purpose, announcing that winter was over, that new life was possible, that even in the harshest places hope could take root and bloom. And as Eliza drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, listening to the eternal song of wind through pine trees, she knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life, a place where she belonged completely, a love that demanded nothing, but offered everything, and the unshakable certainty that some promises once made last forever.